focus my practice on the diagnosis and treatment of older adults with cognitive problems, which means that one of the more common diseases that I deal with is Alzheimer's disease, but it's not the only disease that I deal with. I co-direct the Memory Center at the Memory Center. The academic offices of the center in this building, a few of the offices are elsewhere. The center itself, where we see patients for diagnosis and treatment, as well as run our various studies, is over at the Framingham Center for Advanced Medicine in the neuroscience space in level 2 there. And I see patients there every Friday. One or more clinicians are there throughout the week. And any given day, we have a variety of different studies going on at the Memory Center. The Memory Center has been around since the 90s. It was originally called the Memory Disorders Clinic. We decided to change the name to something to capture better the fact that we were a center doing research and care, and of course we were part of Penn. We thought that was a more apt name. You can learn all about the center by visiting our website, which is pennmemorycenter.org. So pennmemorycenter.org, and it's a very vital, up-to-date website that describes who we are, what we do, the faculty, the researchers, the staff, as well as a very active news site. We are a very strong communications team that runs that website, as well as keeps up on the news about what's happening, not just at the center, but nationally and internationally in the space of Alzheimer's disease and related other diseases of the brain. And you can sign up to be on our I was going to say mailing list, that's not correct because most of what we send out is email. But you can sign up to be on our regular Insight magazine. It comes out weekly by email and yearly in a very large print volume. And that's a very active weekly news magazine updating you on what's happening at the center and elsewhere. So that's an overview of the Memory Center, just a little bit more about a Memory Center. The Memory Center is actually very unusual. There are very few of them. Most of them exist at academic medical centers. And I think part of the reason is because most of the physicians that do work focused on the diagnosis and treatment of memory disorders in older adults tend to be also researchers, and so they are typically affiliated with academic medical center. There are a few memory centers that are completely not affiliated with academic medical centers. And generally those are one of two kinds. Most of them are also clinical trial centers, in other words, they're studying drugs to treat people with Alzheimer's disease. I've found one only, but probably there's some more, whose focus is on purely on patient care. The one I found is called Memory Cares. It's in Asheville, North Carolina. And I'm telling you about that because I talked to the person who runs Memory Cares, Dr. Knoll, and she told me the story of Framingham. The bottom line is that if you try to set up a memory clinic focused only on older adults that have a cognitive problem, it is a total money-losing operation. In other words, if you rely on billing Medicare, which is the primary insurer for most people who are over 65, if you rely on billing on Medicare only as your source of income, you'll only get about 30% of what you need to cover your costs, and so she had to figure out how to get the other 70%. I'm telling you all this to show you how sort of odd, for as common the problem of Alzheimer's is, how poorly we've set up a healthcare system to support the diagnosis and treatment of patients. Many of the patients I see on a typical Friday, the reason why they're there is because for the last 2 or 3 years they've seen a variety of doctors and never gotten a clear answer about what's wrong. Is it Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment? Could it be dementia? We're not too sure. That's a very common complaint that I get, and we have to sort of sort that out. So I think it shows you how sort of disorganized things are right now in the space of diagnosis and treating older adults with a cognitive complaint. I've been using a lot of terms, so let me sort of try to be a little more specific. When we talk about dementia, what we're talking about is a term that simply describes disabling cognitive impairments that have been around for at least 6 to 12 months, so for a while. And by disabling, I mean the person's just not able to do things as well as they used to. And things that they used to do, okay, like managing their money, traveling from place to the other, baking, cooking, using technology, like the computer or the remote control. And again, these things were always a trouble. That's not the point. The point is I used to be pretty good at, managing my taxes and paying my bills, but there's been some mistakes on that. I used to be fine driving my way around the Philadelphia area, but I've gotten lost. I used to bake, but the last time I baked, it was a total chaos of problems. And so someone with dementia has cognitive problems, troubles with memory, attention, concentration, language, spatial function, and those cognitive problems mean they're having trouble doing those daily activities. And someone else has to help them out. So typically that's a family member who steps in and sort of helps out to make sure the bills are paid and medications are taken. And that's what describes dementia. And then there are many different diseases that cause dementia. The most common disease, we think, is Alzheimer's disease, a disease of the brain. Other diseases that cause dementia are Parkinson's disease, so not uniformly, but many people with Parkinson's, particularly if they developed it after their 60s or 70s, develop cognitive problems. Lewy body disease causes dementia. That's what Robin Williams had. He had Lewy body disease. It's a particular pathology in the brain. Neuropathologists will see it and say, oh, that's a Lewy body disease, or a very typical story. Frontotemporal lobar degeneration causes dementia. Vascular disease can cause dementia. HIV infection can cause dementia. Syphilis infection ultimately can cause dementia. So a lot of different diseases can cause dementia. Of course, people can have one or more of those diseases mixed. So a whole different set of diseases. But the one that people pay the most attention to, because it's believed to be the most common, and also kind of has become kind of the iconic term to kind of help understand the complicated world of cognitive problems with aging, is Alzheimer's disease. But it's not the only cause. So that's what dementia is, and that's what Alzheimer's is, and that's how they're different. Another term that I bet you some of you have heard, well, I'll ask you actually, if anyone ever heard the term mild cognitive impairment? If you have, raise your hand. I have, so I'll raise my hand. Yeah, so a fair number of you. So mild cognitive impairment, like dementia, simply describes a clinical situation of the problem the person has. It's a bit of a more nuanced concept, but it's almost the term itself almost says what it is. It's cognitive impairment, but it's mild. Meaning that after a careful assessment, a clinician like myself says, I don't think there's enough impairment here to fit that category of dementia, but there clearly has been change. This person's just not the way they were before with their memory, attention, concentration, spatial function. It's a change. And mild cognitive impairment didn't exist until about 1999, actually. Before that, in the literature, you could find people talking about mild memory problems and age-associated memory impairment, age-adjusted memory impairment. But no, we never made it into clinical practice. It was always this very vague idea. And then a group at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, published a paper about mild cognitive impairment. And it's been one of the most heavily cited papers in the history of Alzheimer's disease research. There are a few others, but it's in the top. And it simply described the outcome of several hundred residents of Rochester, Minnesota, who had this mild memory problem. And what they found was over about 5 years, the folks who had a mild memory problem were more likely than folks who didn't to develop dementia caused by Alzheimer's disease. And so mild cognitive impairment suddenly went from being a mysterious age-related memory problem to being potentially an early stage of Alzheimer's disease. And it's been there ever since. And it was created, as I say, at the Mayo Clinic because they have the ability to study thousands of older adults very carefully in their very organized healthcare system that they set up there. They have a very careful medical record, always is carefully tracked. Everyone goes there, they trust Mayo, and so they'll let them do studies on it. It's a very interesting story of how they were to discover mild cognitive impairment. So we diagnose people with mild cognitive impairment, and much like dementia, many different diseases can cause mild cognitive impairment. It can be a sign of early Alzheimer's, it can be a sign of early Lewy body disease, it can be a sign of a host of medical problems that are causing cognitive impairment. It could be a bad day of testing if you overly rely on testing, and So in other words, mild cognitive impairment doesn't necessarily mean the person has a disease in their brain, and if they have a disease, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have Alzheimer's disease. It matters because mild cognitive impairment, because number one, it suggests you may be at risk of having to climb down the road, and so it's useful then to have a system set up to keep an eye on how you're doing. So I have family members who have mild cognitive impairment, and we put together a very careful system to monitor how they're doing. I look at I get all the bank statements online, and I can see how they're doing paying their bills. And I have the neighbors checking in, making sure things are okay. And they send me texts every now and then. So because I know the person's at risk of having problems, and so I want to keep an eye rather than being surprised, by the 5-alarm fire that I could have not had happen had I been on top of the problem, for example. So I've just given you, in just 10-15 minutes, an overview of dementia, Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment, what's a memory center, and why there's been such frustration to create good memory centers throughout the United States of America. I have probably, in those few small remarks, created questions. And so what I'll do is take questions on what I've said so far, just on what I've said so far. And then next, what I'll do is talk about what we know about what raises your risk of developing cognitive problems and what you can do to reduce that risk. So I'll talk about those things. So if you have questions about that, hold those questions. But is there any questions about what I've said so far, just to clarify that? And there's a hand right there.
What is your opinion of the Medicare screening that you do when we go to have a physical?
Yeah, so the question was the opinion of the Medicare screening when you go to have a physical, and I think what you're getting at is what's known as the annual wellness visit. So when the Affordable Care Act was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Obama, in the statute, in the language that Congress passed, it authorized Medicare to create an annual wellness visit. So it's statutory authorization by Congress. And that annual wellness visit, in the language of the statute, says assessments of hearing, vision, weight, and the detection of the presence of any cognitive impairment. That's actually what the statute says, the detection of, quote, any cognitive impairment. Which, when I read that, I thought, well, that's really fascinating, because I don't know how we would do that. But that's what Congress said we should do. And that was a big scramble then by Medicare to say, well, we know how to weigh someone, we know how to check their hearing, we know how to, but how would you detect the presence of any cognitive impairment? It got complicated very quickly because there are many different ways to measure cognition, to measure memory, attention, concentration. There's no one scale to use. There's no one pounds or kilograms. Just get on it, we'll know how much you weigh. There's lots of different ways to test and to score. And no one way has emerged as low way. Each one has trade-offs. It can be overly sensitive and claim there's impairment when there isn't, or be very insensitive and not pick up impairment when it's obviously there. But it was an effort, I think, to recognize that we should care just as much about cognitive problems as we do weight loss, and vision loss, and hearing loss. It's just harder to figure it out. And so what a lot of practitioners have done is figure it out. Like, well, we know how to weigh someone and check their hearing, but what are we going to do about cognitive impairment? And I think it's a work in progress. At the geriatrics practice here, they do a combination of, I think, what are probably sort of standard of the right test to do for that kind of come in and just see how you're doing. They made what's called a mini-cog. We don't need to detail it. Other practices do other things. Some avoid it altogether, or they just say, how's your memory? You're having any problems? The person says they're not, and that's good to go. So I think it is an effort, though, to try and raise awareness and recognize the importance of doing some kind of testing to see if there's something wrong with your memory that needs to be further looked into. But it's a work in progress. You had a question. Oh, actually, she did it right there.
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned that some of the signs of dementia are cognitive attention, memory, concentration, spatial relationships. Was there something else you said?
So the typical story for dementia is troubles with memory and troubles with attention, multitasking, concentration, and troubles with spatial function. So wayfinding, getting from point A to point B. So memory is I'm going to teach you 6 words and have you do something else for 30 minutes and then ask you 30 minutes later what were those 6 words. the way you test memory is, you're told something by your friend. We're going to go to this great lecture. We're also announced at noon, and then they come over to your house today, and you say, "Why are you here?" or if you say, "Yeah, I can't wait to go to the lecture," then you remembered that lecture. So clinically, some of the best signs of memory loss, some very telltale signs that someone's having a memory problem, are repetitious questions. We all forget something and occasionally ask again, but someone who is sort of asking, getting an answer, and then 3 hours later asking the same question. And repeating new information, like, some of us are great anecdotal tellers, we tell the same damn stories over and over again, so be it. But it's that story like, last week the grandkids came over and they played basketball. It was so much fun because, and then the next day, last week the grandkids came over and they played basketball. It was so much fun. Nice, good. And then my grandfather said he would repeat himself in his letters. I looked back at his letters and he would tell me over and over again how my brother came and painted the house. This is the 5th time, the 5th letter that I've heard the same thing about Keith painting the house. Alzheimer's disease. Yes?
You were saying, I'm sorry.
You're welcome.
You were saying that certain diseases could cause impairment. Well, is this impairment ever reversible?
Depends on the disease.
Okay.
So for example, if you have cognitive impairment caused by HIV, people who then start antiretroviral therapy often show improvement in their cognitive function, in their physical function, in their functional abilities. And I will say as well, when I have diagnosed patients with Alzheimer's, once we get a treatment plan going, I often notice some of them improve. So how could that be? There's no treatment for Alzheimer's available. There's no drug that I can prescribe, like I can prescribe adriamycin for breast cancer. I don't do that. I'm not an oncologist. But what we have found is that, particularly patients who come in where their social and environmental situation is so disorganized, they're so lacking in health, and they have anxiety disorder, and their families don't quite know what's going on. Once we put the diagnosis out, educate the family and the patient about the diagnosis and how to manage the problems, create a typical day that's safe, social, and engaged, and treat the anxiety disorder, 5-6 months later, the families all say, he's doing much better. Not cured, but really doing much better. And in contrast, the families that, I don't make it about the family, but it is really about the family, the patient and the people, or the patients who have no one, where things are just getting more chaotic. Those patients I tend to find go down much better. There was another hand, yeah.
Yes, the wellness visit that you referred that Medicare covers, the wellness visit.
Yeah.
Is that a one-time?
Yeah, the wellness visit is once a year.
Always one?
Yeah, once a year. So practitioners try to bill twice a year. Medicare rejects the second claim because it's an annual wellness visit. So
Because I haven't heard of this as a
What's
one-time visit, and that was it. No.
Well, they can be repeated every year. In the 50s and 60s, the federal government funded a study called the Framingham Heart Study. And, many of you might have heard of Framingham. It's a town, city, really, in Massachusetts. And they enrolled many, many, many people who live there into this annual assessment of their heart health. And this was back when heart disease was destroying America, particularly the American male. So, of course, the American male Congress said we've got to do something about that and heavily funded heart research. That's true. They gave a lot of money to the National Heart and Blood Institute. And Framingham was responsible for many groundbreaking discoveries. Among those groundbreaking discoveries were it really established the causal relationship between high blood pressure, stroke, and heart attack. And it helped to really solidify high blood pressure with aging as not just age-related changes in your blood pressure, but a disease-related phenomenon. In other words, high blood pressure causes stroke and heart failure. It's not just aging vasculature compensating, for example. It established a lot of the early data to show that lipid disorders cause heart disease, high lipids are causal. Around the 70s, they started to measure the cognition in residents of the Framingham study. And so from the 1970s until now, they began to gather data about the cognitive abilities of the residents of Massachusetts, and they began to diagnose them with dementia or not having dementia. And what the Framingham study began to yield fruit from that research by the last decade or so. So they had accumulated about 40, 50 years of data of aging residents of Framingham, Massachusetts, not just their aging hearts, but their aging brains. And what they showed was the older people got, the more likely they were to get dementia. And that's no surprise, that you can't publish a paper on that anymore. You can say that the result is not very interesting. But the reason why they made the New England Journal of Medicine with their results was that they showed that there were certainly more people every 5 years in Framingham with dementia, but there weren't as many as they expected. In other words, the risk of developing dementia was actually declining from the 1970s. So plenty of people getting dementia, but not as many as they expected. The risk of developing dementia was declining. And that was an incredible finding. And the reason why it's an incredible finding is because, like I said earlier, there are no effective treatments like there are for heart disease or cancer to treat the common causes of dementia, like Alzheimer's disease. I can't describe a drug that I can tell you this will slow down your Alzheimer's disease. And so the question is, well, what's going on to explain how over 40 years of observation, relentlessly every 5 years, the risk of developing dementia was declining. Still plenty of people getting it, but just not as risky as it used to be. And what iterated that finding was the same finding was found in Copenhagen, and the same finding was found in Rotterdam, and the same finding was found in the HRS study, the Health and Retirement Study. So that something's going on in Western countries, because all those studies are in Western countries, that despite the aging of the population, the risk of developing dementia is declining. Because there's so many people aging, you're getting a lot of people get dementia, you're just not getting as many as you thought you were going to get. Okay. So there's still about, in the United States, at least 5 to 6 million people with Alzheimer's. There just weren't as many as you thought there would be. And so they looked closer at the data to say, well, what might explain this reduced risk? And across all the studies, you see a common set of answers, and they generally revolve around two things. One is improvement in cardiovascular health. And so what they showed was that the individuals who had less cardiovascular disease, or if they had developed cardiovascular disease, had a stroke or a heart attack, had gotten treatment for it, survived it and then gotten treatment, that they were the ones that were less likely. So people who didn't smoke were less likely. So the more you reduce cardiovascular risk factors, the more it seemed to reduce the risk of getting dementia. And so that's been repeated across a number of studies. So there's something about vascular health that we think is helping your heart, for example, that is also helping the brain. And that may be one explanation for why. And when you start to broaden out vascular health, well, then you get into things like, well, what are things that maintain vascular health? Well, yes, lowering my blood pressure, not smoking tobacco, cigarettes, treating high blood cholesterol. But we also have good data that cardiovascular health is maintained by exercise. About 150 minutes a week of exercise. It's a fair amount. You take 7 and divide it by 150, my math serves me right. It's about 20 minutes a day of daily exercise. So if you skip a day, you've already got 30 minutes in order to make up. So about 30 minutes a day, 5-6 days a week of exercise, for example. And indeed, that has been shown to reduce the risk of developing dementia, a regular exercise habit. And so actually the field began to create a maxim, a message. What's good for your heart is good for your brain. You can hear my colleagues will say that. There was recently a study to look at more refined treatment of high blood pressure in older adults, 70-plus-year-old older adults, targeting a more intensive blood pressure reduction. And one of the side results of that study, in addition to cardiovascular endpoints about heart attacks and stroke, was a decreased risk of developing cognitive impairment. And that's one of the studies to show in an intervention experiment that if you treat high blood pressure, you might actually prevent developing cognitive problems. Very provocative, very important study. There's another result from studies like Framingham that explains why there's reduced risk of developing dementia. And that was that individuals who reported greater than a high school or less than a high school or less education, had a higher risk of developing dementia. And this general finding across studies is an association between the years of formal education and the risk of developing dementia later in life. And you think about it, it's interesting. So we're done education somewhere in our 20s, roughly, and yet dementia occurs on average in the 70s. So what's going on? What's going on there? And this is something that, that remains unanswered. Is it that all that education builds up a rich network of super smart neurons that back each other up and withstand the next 40 years of insults such that when the disease comes along, that educated, healthy brain is better able to withstand the pathology, this idea of cognitive reserve? Is that what's going on? Is it that in some countries, especially this country, education creates opportunities or not opportunities for social and economic well-being, and therefore for the remaining years, if you don't have adequate access to basic social and economic necessities, that therefore by the time it increases your likelihood to be vulnerable to diseases. And I think that actually is a very compelling story in America, because for example, we know that poor dental health is associated with dementia. Studies, and I think what that has to do with is dental health in America is very much functioning to afford dental insurance or pay out of pocket. And most people sacrifice dental care right away before to be able to pay their grocery bill. And so I think that's a spurious finding. I think poor dental health reflects the sadness of America's unequal provision of the right to health care to maintain our economic and social security. So I think a lot of the education story is a story of, in America, of access and equity, as opposed to necessarily just being all about big, strong, educated brains. It gets more complicated because there's excellent data that 12 years, well, I'll give you the story. Mayo Clinic discovered MCI. And the testing they used was elegant cognitive testing they developed. They took those same cognitive tests and they took them to their clinic in Jacksonville, Florida. And they used the same tests on the Jacksonville, Florida population. And they were like, my God, there's so much dementia here. And yet, the investigators were like, this doesn't make any sense because they don't score very well, but they're doing okay, the people that we're labeling. What's going on here? And they did what any good person asked. They asked questions of their very data. And so when they asked the residents of Jacksonville, tell me about the 12 years of education you got, what many of them said was, well, it was half-day school. In other words, I went to school, but we only had school one half-day a week. And then because there were too many kids, and so the school was cut that you only went for half day, and then the other kids went for the other half a day. And typically that was in African American neighborhoods in Jacksonville, segregated schools, whereas the kids in the white schools went all day. So 12 years of education in Jacksonville if you were white was 12 years of education, whereas 12 years of education in Jacksonville if you were black was less than that, it was maybe 8. And so what they discovered was that you can't just look at the number of years of education, because the quality of education is very different. And that is that's not science, that's just injustices in America. And so the story around the risk of education and developing Alzheimer's disease and dementia is a very complicated story that I think iterates a lot of, not just, well, it iterates a lot of both neuroscience, but also social economic, and frankly justice issues to be sorted out. So, cardiovascular health, and all the things that maintain our heart are all associated with maintaining our brain. And it is not too late to take action on those things. So it is not too late when you see clear benefits even later in life to readdressing cardiovascular risk factors, to taking up an exercise habit. And those data are very compelling as well. There's compelling data about individuals who lack social and cognitive engagement for in their later years are higher risk of developing cognitive impairment. And I think the data there are very compelling. It's not that they're, because this is following people over 5-10 years before they develop dementia. And those people over 5 or 10 years who have that reduction in social and cognitive, you can see them later on developing cognitive impairment. And people hear that result, they say, well, so what? And I think from a policy perspective, that's a very important finding. It's why, if I was running a government, I would say, well, that's why we need senior centers. That's why we need public transportation, and that's why we need sidewalks. Because if you build a community where people can't get out, or can't get to places, where there's no place for them to go, or they have to pay a lot of money to get into the gym, well then it's not just creating entertainment that you're denying them things that are essential to maintain their health and their well-being. And so that's, I think, a public policy argument for why senior centers aren't just entertainment for retired people. They're actually essential for their health and their well-being. And people that get to the senior center has to be supported as well. So those are sort of policy points. Let me pause and see if anything I've said has raised any questions about, yes, from the very far back.
Yeah, assuming that Alzheimer's and dementia are affiliated with fading or dead brain cells, are there certain foods or exercises or over-the-counter medication that can revive fading brain cells?
So the question is, are there any foods, over-the-counter medicines that can help maintain brain cells? And the answer on foods is the evidence around a diet that is viewed as heart healthy has a nice overlap with a diet that is brain healthy. I would urge you to take a look at diets that are described as called the Mediterranean diet. That has been described as a heart healthy diet and a brain healthy diet. As far as over-the-counter medicines, or to more broad supplements, it's a big market. How many get like flyers, ads, or other things about things, pills or other things that you can buy, like Focus Factor, or Mind RX, or Prevagen, or anyone get those in the mail? Yeah, and there was a period of time where the field really was studying ginkgo, et cetera, and there's two things. The ones that we've studied, ginkgo is one, for example, put a lot of money and time into ginkgo in the 80s and the 90s. It just didn't pan out. But more importantly, many of those things that are sold online, like Focus Factor and Mind RX, if you look at the data that they've got to show that this works, they don't have any data. They're very, at best, there's some claims about, it has a lot of vitamin E, and vitamin E is good. And that, as long as, and that gets them sold. So I can't recommend, what works we should use, but when I look to see, well, show me that X or Y, Z works, I'm happy if there are ones that you've heard about or hey, what about X, to speak of it, because I'm speaking in general terms now. But I think in general, the money that you would spend on those things, I would take that money and spend it on something like a gym membership, or a trainer for the gym membership, because one good way to use your gym membership is to then buy a trainer who will force you to do things, for example. Or go out with your friends, or take me out for a Mediterranean diet. So that's what I would use my money for. Because you can spend a lot of money on that stuff. I mean, I see some people putting out about $100, $200 a month on that kind of thing. That's better stuff. Yes, right there, the blue. Yeah.
I've heard that household mold can sometimes cause dementia. Is that how dangerous is household mold?
Household mold, I've not seen a study to help me. I just don't know. Yeah.
I heard that there was they are calling now Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes? And also, my other question, there is a connection, I understand, between your gut and your brain through the vagus nerve. So if would it benefit then you to really have this Mediterranean or more plant-based thing that would improve?
Yeah, so two questions. One was type 3 diabetes, very, almost a tagline there, you know, like the bottom line is I think the brain lives off of only one nutrient, which is glucose. It's a very provocative area of research that could nerve cell death, neurodegeneration, seen in Alzheimer's or other diseases, be related to difficulties metabolizing or otherwise managing glucose. And the answer to that is an active area of investigation. We did a study using an anti-diabetes medicine that is very provocative data to suggest maybe this will treat, and it was totally negative. It was using metformin, which actually someone in this room was on metformin. It didn't hurt, but it didn't help in changing the rate of decline. That's just one study. The microbiome connection to the brain is also an area of very intense interest. I can't make and therefore you should do X clinically, but I will say that every time a microbiome study comes along, initially what sounds like kind of like, what? Suddenly becomes a very interesting finding to better explain the relationship between our environment and whatever other organ is in there. Having said that, I don't think anything's made it into clinical practice now. Like, oh, so therefore you should do X because it'll affect your microbiome. I don't think we've made those kind of clinical conclusions. The way, for example, people with Crohn's disease, which is a disease of the colon, there's great evidence about microbiome-based treatments for Crohn's disease. I mean, that's made a spectacular progress in that disease, for example. Other questions? Yes?
Is amyloid plaque found in all aging brains?
Yeah, so the question is amyloid plaque found in all aging brains? Amyloid plaque, of course, matters because when a neuropathologist is handed the brain of someone who had dementia, that a clinician like me said I think it was Alzheimer's, the neuropathologist will say, well, let me have a look, and they'll slice the brain and they'll look, and what they're looking for are three things. They're looking for dead neurons, absent neurons where there should have been. I don't see a lot of neurons here. That's one. The second thing they're looking for are tangles, they call them. Those are tangles of a protein called tau. And the third thing they're looking for is amyloid. They're looking for these plaques of amyloid. And that's what they'll see. And so when John Georgianowski sends me an autopsy report, he'll talk about the dense neurofibrillary tangles and plaques and neurodegeneration consistent with the Alzheimer's disease. If you take the brains of older adults, particularly adults in their 80s, 90s, even centenarians, and you slice those up, and you say to the pathologist, tell me if you see plaques. The older those brains are chronologically, the more likely they'll say, oh, I see plaques. There are plaques there. If you then say to the clinician, did that person have dementia? The older that individual is, into their 90s, oftentimes there's very little relationship between the neuropathologist saying, I saw plaques, and the clinician saying, she had dementia or he didn't have dementia. And what we think is going on there is that independent of Alzheimer's, in the later years of life, there's a plaque accumulation that is independent of the disease. The kinds of plaques, the amount are different than what you see in Alzheimer's disease, so it's not well worked out. But after the age of 90, the relationship between what's seen in the brain and clinical findings is often very fuzzy compared to someone in their 60s, 70s, or even their early 80s, where the correspondence between what's seen in the brain and what happened in life is often much tighter. So that's a very, very active area of research to better understand what's going on in the 90s or so when people have plaques, but yet didn't have any cognitive problems. Yeah, great question. It's a cutting edge question, as we said. Yes?
Is there a relationship with somebody with Down syndrome and...
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Is there a relationship with somebody with Down syndrome getting Alzheimer's?
Is there a relationship between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's? And that's a very, also excellent question. We are entering into The Down syndrome story is a fascinating story for two reasons. The first is, if you have Down and you live long enough, you almost invariably develop a decline in cognition. And if I take that Down syndrome person and either image their brain or autopsy it, invariably you see changes that look a lot like Alzheimer's disease. There's a bit of debate amongst the pathologists and whatnot, is it exactly what, but you definitely see plaques and tangles, especially amyloid plaques. And it's almost universal to persons with Downs if they live to their 30s, 40s, 50s to develop this. And it's probably related because you can trace it from the chromosomal abnormality to that chromosomal abnormality. Chromosome 21 handles amyloid processing, has a role in amyloid processing. So you can begin to make a mechanistic molecular link. But I said there were two reasons why it was fascinating. Once upon a time, if you had Down syndrome, you generally didn't live to beyond, on average, about 12 years of age, on average. A very common reason why a child with Downs died was after birth, they would go to rest, and within 2 days, they would start vomiting. And doctors would say, oh, that's it. This is how they die. A lot of them do. And they would die. They would dehydrate. They could not. What they had was Karlawish stenosis that the stomach couldn't empty. And so they just simply would die of not being able to eat or drink because the stomach couldn't empty. And a surgery was developed called Karlawish stenosis surgery to open up the pylorus. And for a while they wouldn't do it on those kids. And then in the 60s it became used as simply abusive to not repair that. And that's the story of Down syndrome, which was repairing the cardiac deficits, giving them vaccines for pneumococcal pneumonia, treating leukemias, many of them have leukemia, it's quite common. Such that the survival of people with Down syndrome went from average on 12 to what we see now, which is in the 50s even, 40s and 50 years of age. And so they're a great story of changing values and progress in medicine. So certainly progress in medicine, some of the cardiac surgeries are elegant for the cardiac defects that children with Downs have, really spectacular microsurgeries that just defy technology. But also had to happen was a change in culture to say that it was just inappropriate to not treat a child with Down syndrome who had a pyloric stenosis. That was just considered wrong. They were not imbeciles, they were people. And so it's an interesting story about kind of how you value people and therefore what you do as a society. And of course, they themselves recapitulate what's happening in our society, which is if you live long enough, then you have these other problems related to cognitive loss. And to talk with the families of the Down syndrome people, they're devoted to trying to find something to do to treat that dementia. And one thing they don't want to do is they don't want to treat the Downs. In other words, one syndrome will just prevent Down syndrome, like do something about the problem. No, that's not the disease. That's just them. You have to be fascinated and think about it, that they're pushing limits of what's normal and what would be the approach to treating that. So I went a little long on that, but I think it's a great story of larger social and cultural things, in addition to obviously the fascinating science around why they get, almost all of them get Alzheimer's. We have time for just one or two more questions. You already asked one, so go ahead.
If a person already has elevated plaque, they're in their 70s, but they test cognitively normal, have there been any longitudinal studies to determine what might slow the development of Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so it's a great question, which is up until 2000, we could only measure amyloid if you died. And so the ghoulish thing about Alzheimer's was you had to die for me to tell you finally what was wrong with you, which of course meant no. And then we began to be able to use an imaging agent that you just lie on a CAT scan table and I can tell you that there's amyloid in your brain or not. And the investigators who presented that first scan of amyloid scan, they call it an amyloid scan. It was at the Swedish meeting in Sweden in 2004 I think. And they said when the slide went up, it was like you hit a baseball and you knew it was going to go out of the park. The audience just became hushed because no one until then had ever seen amyloid visualized in a living human brain. It was that monumental of an image that people remember where they were when they saw it. Okay, so fast forward to now. Those scans are becoming more readily available in clinical research settings. And we can now do a scan in a human, test her cognition, and we do have people who have, they're cognitively impaired, they have elevated amyloid, and we know from studies that they're in a group that's more likely over time to develop cognitive impairment. We can't estimate that risk with great precision yet, we don't have enough data, but as a group, it's a higher risk group. And so what we're doing now is testing drugs in those individuals to see, could this drug given to you for 4 or 5 years slow that risk of decline that we see in individuals with elevated amyloid? To date, we've done about, or we have either done, or doing, or planning about 9 studies like that. We have 3 of them going on here at the Memory Center. To date, none of those studies have either shown a drug that worked or finished yet. There were 2 that failed. The drug clearly didn't work and they stopped it early. The rest are ongoing or in planning. We'll be starting 2 more actually later this year. It's a very popular is not the right word. It's a very important area and very busy area of research. And on our website, memoryset.org, we talk about those studies. And we have, as I say, 2 more coming up by the end of this calendar year that will start early next year to do just that. And I've been very involved in those studies.
So you would just recommend the same things for the heart healthy?
Yes. So if I wasn't, if I had elevated amyloid and it was cognitively impaired, I would look for a drug study. I'd have a tough time getting one now because I'm so busy with work. But if I could take the time to do the drug study, I would probably join one because I think that would make sense. And then I would do the things I talked about around cardiovascular health, and give more lectures. I'll take one more question. Yeah, you go ahead. Yep. Yeah.
So basically what you're saying is that is really not going to help anybody to keep their brain healthy.
Yeah, so the question is like Sudoku and word puzzles keeping your brain healthy. This is a very, one of those areas, controversial areas. Again, much like nutraceuticals and related over-the-counter things, the billion-dollar market, I think the amount of money people spend on those things show you the desperation to do something. I think I look at that dollar figure and say it's telling us something about how desperate people are to do something. Okay? If you like those kind of activities, I think they're just the kind of activity you should do because for just basic human flourishing, if you enjoy Sudoku, do Sudoku, you know. But I wouldn't do something like that. I think the data that says it will preserve your brain, you will not reduce your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or dementia, is very thin at best. And so if you're doing those as opposed to something you want to do or like doing, I think that's a mistake. But if you enjoy, I mean, I know people who really like Sudoku, they really enjoy the challenge, etc. Do it, you know. But I wouldn't do it the way I would take my Lipitor. I don't take Lipitor, but you know, I don't think, I mean, you may get pleasure from taking your pills, like being facetious and joking. But there's some things we do just because we've got to. You know, I don't like to brush my teeth, I don't dislike it, but you know, I have to. So if Sudoku is like brushing your teeth, spend your money on something else. But if you like doing it, great, because I do think that kind of social cognitive, it's not so social as you're being, is good for the brain. But if you don't have good data that doing it for the sake of doing it will prevent it. Very mixed answer. It is at the top of the hour, and I think I was told we end at 1. I don't want to cause chaos on the streets.
It's fine, because you started a little later.
Okay, then one more question.
Just a medication question.
Yeah.
What's the problem and metformin causing you to have falls?
Does metformin cause you to have falls? I don't know that, but if you Google that, does metformin cause you to have falls or metformin and Lexapro? I don't know about either in terms of risk risk of fall. But one of the good things about the internet is that the mandated patient education forms for all medicines and their risk are very easily available if you Google metformin side effects, and you can look patient information and it'll show you what those. There's no secret about that. Those data summary sheets are very well. So I don't really. Those are great questions. Graduate level seminar or something.